Hey, welcome to our industry keynote chat. I'm Daniel Pickett, the Chief Technology and Data Officer at FreightWaves, and joining me here is Mark Yeager, the CEO of Redwood. We're going to talk a little bit about growing a sustainable supply chain. So, welcome, Mark.
Thanks, Daniel. Great to be here.
Well, we're excited to have you guys, especially from Redwood, tell us about what's happening around sustainability. I guess tell me a little bit about what you're seeing from the customer demand side. We know everybody loves to say they're sustainable when they save money because of, lower fuel prices or whatever. Are we getting to a place where this is an important feature for customers yet?
Yeah, I think it's a very important feature for customers right now. It's very much front and center. I think in a way that historically it never has been before. So I think sustainability is becoming a critical issue. A lot of our shippers are hearing about sustainability. From there, the ultimate consumer is very concerned about sustainability, and I also think that we're starting to see real involvement from the investor community, really looking for meaningful carbon reduction efforts. And our shippers really want to step up and do what they can in a pragmatic and practical way to reduce their carbon footprint. The debate has always raged, are people willing to pay for it, right? And I think that's always been a question. And the good news is that a lot of activities and a lot of initiatives that can help you reduce your carbon footprint can also save money at the same time. So whether you're talking about modal conversion or consolidation from parcel to LTL or LTL to truckload, these are things that have both environmental benefits, but also help you hit your budget and help you reduce cost over the course of time. I also think people are more willing now to make some expenditures toward reducing their carbon footprint. Not everybody's ready to hire a chief sustainability officer, but for example, we're seeing a lot of folks who are willing to step up and purchase carbon offsets in order to get closer to that net zero goal. So while I believe that folks aren't willing to pay a disproportionate amount to go green, there's a lot of strategies that we can implement at relatively low cost that help us have a meaningful input on carbon emissions.
That's fantastic. Do you feel like it's going to be economics, or is it going to be federal policy, or state by state going to really, provide the catalyst, provide the push to get, I guess more shippers to be thinking about the way some of these forward ones you're working with are?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, right? And clearly the economics have to be there. And we're still a long ways away with many of these strategies from making it economically viable, right? So there's still a lot of effort that needs to be done, a lot of innovation that's necessary to make things like electric vehicles, a real practical substitute for diesel. But at the same time, I do believe that that we're at a point where public perception has shifted in favor of sustainability. There's real concern out there among the public, and it's probably going to take a joint effort, right? I don't think the answer is completely federal or state regulation. At the same time, we should recognize that regulation does play a role, and it can incentivize behavior if it's properly constructed. I grew up in Chicago in the 1970s, and I remember what the Chicago River was like, and what driving down the street was like, and all the litter and how polluted the river was. And there was a real change in public perception at that time, but there was also an engagement at a state and federal level to clean up our waterways and clean up our environment in general, and it had a really positive impact. I think that kind of joint effort is going to be what's necessary to really make carbon reduction a sustainable initiative that has a real impact longer term.
Sure. Have you heard anything about from your customers about the SEC potential for reporting carbon emissions, and is that a motivating factor in some of the customers you've talked to?
It is. I think I think that certainly when you're faced with some type of a federal mandate, right, it's going to drive some behavior. Realistically, it only applies to a relatively select group of companies, but I think folks can see that in some ways the writing's on the wall, right? That whether it's coming from the SEC or whether it's coming from their own customers or the investors or their private equity partners, whoever it happens to be, folks are looking for very real initiative to quantify, which is where it all starts. Quantifying your carbon footprint, and then going down the path of taking on initiatives that have a real quantifiable benefit and real reduction opportunities. So yes, I do think that more and more folks are looking at the overall momentum, and some of it's coming from government forces, and some of it's coming from the private sector, and that's likely to have um, more of them taking this seriously. At the same time, most shippers can't afford to go out and hire significant outside resources. They certainly don't have those resources on staff. So they're trying to find ways to get, real baseline calculation and also real momentum going forward to try to get to, real carbon reduction initiatives that they can, fit within their budget, but also have a real impact on their footprint.
Yeah. So, well, as a third-party logistics provider, you don't design the packaging or the product. You don't own the equipment. So it seems like you don't have a great deal of control over the carbon profile of a shipment. But what role should 3PLs like Redwood be playing in as we try to build a greener supply chain?
Yeah, look, I think that you're correct, right? There's a lot of decisions that we don't control. There's a lot of decisions outside of transportation, certainly, where a company like Redwood can only have a limited effect, right? But when you look at the most progressive companies, for the most part, they've tackled phase one and phase two emissions, right? Phase one is sort of, your direct emissions, and then phase two is all about the energy that you're consuming in the process, right? At the same time, the shippers that have gone down that path have quickly realized that the majority of their carbon emissions are associated with their supply chain. You see a lot of different numbers, but it could be 80. I've read numbers as high as 94% of emissions are up and down the supply chain. And within that segment, transportation is huge. And in fact, I've read a lot of studies that indicate that transportation is actually a bigger component of carbon emissions than even energy production itself, which is amazing. And because of the nature of our elongated supply chain, what we have seen is that transportation is becoming a bigger and bigger piece of the carbon emissions footprint. And in fact, it's projected to grow substantially over the course of the next 20 years if we don't take some real action to try to make it, more carbon efficient. So what we really want to do is focus there on the things that we can control, right? And I think that, as this has evolved, because it's still early stage, but as this has evolved, what we've seen is that folks really need help from the beginning assessing that baseline. Let's quantify your carbon footprint from a transportation perspective in a way that everyone can rally around and understand. From there, I think a 3PL can really assist in developing real initiatives, whether it's tactical around transportation, things like, modal conversion or dynamic consolidation or empty mile reduction. So certainly can help both develop those solutions and work with carriers to implement, track, and monitor those solutions as well. What we're also seeing, and something that's definitely on our radar screen, is offering to the shipper the ability to purchase certified carbon offsets, right, to help them get closer and closer to net zero. Because I think the reality, and there's some debate on this in the space, but the reality is, in the near term, it's almost impossible to get to net zero without some type of carbon offset program as part of your sustainability portfolio.
It is, yeah, certainly. And so do you see that as that's going to be table stakes for brokers, for third party logistics providers, is to have this kind of data and these kind of options for offsetting, or is that going to be what a minority of 3PLs are doing? How important is that going to be for your point of this, your part of the supply chain?
Sure, absolutely. I think it's early days to say table stakes. I think eventually we'll get there. But I do think that there's a number of progressive 3PLs that have recognized this need. In conversations with their customers, they see that they just don't have the internal resources necessary to, do that initial audit, really come up with sustainable programs, and then track and monitor them long term. So I do think we're going to see more and more 3PLs step up in this regard. And it will become an increasing expectation as shippers start to turn from phase one and phase two to phase three. They're going to look for partners that can really help them tackle that much bigger and, by the way, much more complicated, segment of their carbon emissions.
Right. It certainly becomes at scope three is where everybody's going to need help, and we're going to need collaboration.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah. And it's complicated, right? We should all understand that.
Absolutely. You talked about some of the most progressive shippers, the ones that maybe their customers or their investors kind of have an ESG mandate for them. What should shippers who maybe are not as far down the path of greening their supply chain, what actions can they take? What innovative approaches have you seen hit the market? You talked about modal conversion and consolidation. What else is out there that we haven't heard of yet?
Well, I think there's a ton of opportunity, and it's not too late, right? This is still early stage. Even the most sophisticated shippers are, far from complete on this journey, right? There's no question about it. But what we are seeing is, every customer is a little bit different, and every supply chain is a little bit different. And where we've seen success is where it's practical and it's pragmatic. So it starts at the top. It starts with a real commitment to sustainability. In our mind, it then follows with a very well thought through and customized baseline to really understand where the opportunities are to reduce your carbon footprint. And then it's sort of tackling piecemeal different kinds of carbon reduction strategies. And certainly, one of them that for many shippers is modal conversion, and then the different types of consolidation. It goes well beyond that, though. I think there's empty mile reduction efforts underway in many cooperative ventures, right? That go to not just the shipper's private fleet, but also helping carriers reduce their empty miles and become more efficient. Reducing wait time, creating more notice for carriers so that they can better plan their network. And what it really requires is a different type of communication and a different type of transparency between the shipper and the carrier community to really understand where those buckets of reduction are. To do so in a way that's affordable. Not everyone can decide that they're going to convert their private fleet to electric, right? That's a great option for some, but it's beyond the reach for most. So what we have to do is systematically identify where those opportunities are, where they can be implemented in a way that's cost effective, right? But also has a very real quantifiable impact on reduction efforts.
Okay. And then you also talked about offsets, which, if you're going to get to zero, you're going to have to do offsets eventually. Is that, I have to imagine 5 years ago, the demand for offsets was next to zero. Where are we today on people being interested in maybe using offsets as a way to improve their supply chain emissions?
Yeah, I think it's changing rapidly, right? It's still, once again, I would say early stages. One of the issues with carbon calculation and then offsets in general is there is a lack of agreed upon standards, and I think we're starting to get real progress there. You got some trade groups that are coming together and really trying to develop standards and averages that are acceptable, across the board, right? But I think carbon offsets has been an area of great debate, right? And trying to differentiate between legitimate carbon offsets and maybe offset programs that are less impactful is important, right? So we're really recommending that if you're going to undertake offset programs, which we do believe are very much viable, right? Make sure that you're doing it with a partner that is taking the effort to understand that these are in fact, accredited programs that are being deployed in the areas that are genuine and also fit with the overall philosophy of the shipper. Most carbon offset programs we see are all about reforestation or alternative energy, but there's a lot of different programs out there, and you can go after things like methane capture. I was reading it, just recently about MIT is exploring a program where they're looking to a carbon offset program that's designed to help emerging countries deploy more fuel efficient equipment to reduce their carbon footprint impact. So it really depends, I think, on the shipper's philosophy. We believe that those programs should be very much customized, and if a shipper has a strong preference for wind energy in Texas, we ought to try to find something that works along those lines. So if folks are more interested in global, there's programs out there for that, but there's also programs available on a more localized basis.
So that's helpful for anyone who's thinking about offsets is to understand all the nuance behind. All offsets are not created equal today, and the devil's in the details. But I've read a bit about some of the standardization you mentioned, and I think that's going to be a good thing as well. Um, so tell me, how do shippers start implementing these programs? Do they just call Redwood? Uh, how can they effectively kind of implement some of these tools and make headway towards sustainability goals? And then also, what is Redwood itself doing, not just for customers?
Yeah, sure, absolutely, absolutely. So, clearly we take sustainability very seriously, and we do think that our shippers increasingly are taking it serious as well. But it's really tough to get started. Even the longest journey though starts with the first step. And what we want to do is help shippers get past that initial concern. Right? It can look daunting. It can look very imposing, and the deeper you get into it, the more complex you realize. But we think that it really all starts once a shipper has made a commitment to sustainability with establishing that baseline, right? And really looking, past phase one, phase two, and really trying to get their head around phase three. And for us, really, it's all about transportation. So how can we help shippers understand what that baseline is? And we're going to be bringing an initiative to bear that we're very excited about that we call Hyperion, and it's going to use we think some state-of-the-art tools to help in that calculation effort. Then we're going to be bringing our executional capability to help quantify, identify, and implement real solutions that are within the reach of our customer base. And from there, we've got some reporting tools that are going to help us really track it. And it's a cycle to a certain extent, right? It's all about tracking your progress and then resetting your targets. Reestablishing that audit baseline and working on new initiatives from there. So it's probably somewhat of a never-ending cycle, but at the same time, it all starts with understanding what your carbon footprint is and what your options are to reduce it. We think Hyperion is going to help our shippers do that in a significant way without overly burdensome costs.
Mark, thanks for your time. I'm excited about anything we can do to clean up the supply chain. I think what you guys are doing is exciting, and you heard it here. Get started today. Take the first step.
Absolutely. It all starts with that first step.
Awesome. Well, we've got thanks so much, Mark, and we've got a ton of more great content coming up today at the Net Zero Carbon Summit. So stay tuned.